The History of Poland Podcast, Episode 56, The Union of Lublin. Hello and welcome back. Last time we left off with the death of Sigismund I the Old in April of 1548. He had reigned for over 40 years and oversaw a time in which the Polish Golden Age continued apace. That would continue in the years to come during the reign of his son, Sigismund Augustus, who we'll pick up with today. For Sigismund, we're going to follow a path that will show how interconnected the pieces of Sigismund's life were. In particular, we're going to start with Sigismund's relationship with his mother, how that influenced his romantic life, how his romantic life tied in with the Protestant Reformation gripping Europe, and how that in turn led to one of the most significant political acts in Polish history, the Union of Lublin. Sigismund's mother was Bona Sforza de Aragona, who in addition to being Queen of Poland during her marriage to Sigismund's father, Sigismund I, was also the Duchess of both Bari and Rossano, duchies in Italy that belonged to her family, the notorious Sforza family. We talked about Bona Sforza in the last episode, so I won't do a full reintroduction. The only thing I'll add to her biography is that she really cared about making sure her son was set up for life. Now, whether this was out of motherly love, altruism, or because she thought a powerful son would lead to more personal security, I'll leave up to you. But I will say that Sigismund's ascension to being king while his father was still alive was the result of Bona's personal intervention and instigation. So, it comes as no surprise that with her husband now gone, Bona will continue to play an active role in shaping her son's life. The activity that had the most influence was her involvement in her son's romantic relationships, and the ensuing results of that interference. As Adam Zamoyski tells us in his book, Poland, a History, quote, in 1543, Sigismund married Elizabeth of Habsburg, daughter of Emperor Ferdinand I, who died only 2 years later, allegedly poisoned by Queen Bona. He then fell in love and eloped with Barbara Radziwiłł, the sister of a Lithuanian magnate. Only 4 years after this marriage, which was opposed by virtually everyone in Poland for a variety of reasons, Barbara Radziwiłł died, and again the Queen Mother was suspected of using her Milanese skills. After considering at length the possibility of marrying Mary Tudor in 1553, Sigismund married his first wife's sister, Catherine of Habsburg, widow of the Duke of Mantua. It was a disastrous marriage. The epileptic queen physically repelled him, and unlike the others, she did not die, perhaps because Queen Bona, feeling more unpopular than ever, had loaded herself up with gold and jewels and fled to Bari in Italy, where, appropriately enough, she was herself eventually poisoned. End quote. As you can imagine, having 3 wives in 10 years, and having 2 of those wives likely murdered by your own mother, was undoubtedly stressful for Sigismund. I bring this up not because his romantic life was especially important in the grand scheme of history, but because the consequences of these events would reverberate up to the present day. It all had to do with the connection between Sigismund's personal relationships and the ongoing Protestant Reformation. By the time of Sigismund's third marriage in 1553, the Protestant Reformation had a full head of steam and was transforming the relationship between individuals and the Church, upending the nature of the associations of different political entities, and introducing a zeal for revisiting previously accepted theological arguments. In Poland, that looked like a spread of Martin Luther's ideas through the German-speaking residents of Western Polish cities, by the conversion of the Duchy of Prussia, as we talked about in a previous episode, and by having Poland serve as a sort of religious sanctuary for nonconformists, whether they be followers of Luther, Calvin, Mennonites, or any other refugee sect. All of that isn't to say that the motives of everyone involved in the anti-papal movement of the day was driven by purely religious motives. Indeed, the relationship between rulers and the Pope was just as significant as that between clergy and cardinals. Which brings us back to Sigismund's personal life. As Adam Zamoyski tells us, quote, since neither of his first 2 wives had borne him any children, the fact that Sigismund Augustus refused to touch his third was a matter of some concern to his subjects. The extinction of a dynasty is always cause for alarm. And in this instance, the alarm was all the greater, as the Jagiellons were still the only real link between Poland and Lithuania. The same begged the king to attend to his wife, repulsive or not, and the primate actually went down on his knees in the chamber to beseech him either to possess her or to cast her off, breaking with Rome if need be. End quote. So that's an extraordinary level of interest in the life of Sigismund. It brings to mind the idea that the ruler's life is not his own, but belongs to the people. In this case, the people demanded an heir, not because they wanted to see a cute baby, but because of the social and political stability that an heir would provide in such a turbulent time. The fact that the idea of breaking with Rome was entertained, if it meant that Sigismund would be able to marry someone else, is remarkable, and as a side note, he didn't remarry again. But even more remarkable is that during a time of intense change, Sigismund was very lackadaisical in his attitude and response. As Zamoyski tells us, quote, "The king's behavior at this point was crucial to both the religious and the political future of Poland. Yet he remained undecided. His attitude to the Reformation was ambivalent. He never showed much sympathy for the Protestant movement, but took a great interest in it, avidly reading all the dissenting tracts and treatises, and accepting the dedication of works by Luther and Calvin. In 1550, he issued an anti-Protestant decree in the hope of winning support from the bishops for his marriage to Barbara Radziwiłł, but this remained a dead letter. A few years later, he rebuked the papal nuncio for urging a firmer line towards the Protestants, and in effect forced him to leave Poland. When asked by his subjects which way they should lean in the religious debate, he replied, quote, "I am not the king of your consciences." End quote. At the risk of injecting my own biases into the narrative, if only all leaders could show such restraint. Nevertheless, while Sigismund may have showed some wisdom in that particular response, he was lackluster in other areas. As religious and political waves crested in Europe, and while his own subjects were clamoring for a clear and coherent policy, Sigismund was largely absent. As Zamoyski tells us, quote, "Unlike Henry VIII of England, Sigismund Augustus did not want a divorce. His love for Barbara Radziwiłł had been a great passion, and her death robbed him of the will to live. He continued to carry out his duties without enthusiasm, dressed in black, and showed no desire to mold the future or perpetuate the dynasty. When pressed by the same in 1555, he took the characteristically non-committal and quite extraordinary step of referring the proposal for a national church to Rome. He sent an envoy to Pope Paul IV with the 4 demands of the same. The Pope listened to them with great sorrow and bitterness of heart, and then rebuked Sigismund for allowing his subjects to formulate such heretical ideas. The matter of the national church rested there, and the reformers were for once unaided by provocative behavior on the part of the Pope. The principal weakness of the Protestant movement in Poland was its lack of unity, and the only candidate for its leadership spent most of his active life in England. Jan Waski, nephew of the Archbishop of the same name and member of what was briefly a rich and powerful family, became a Protestant while studying abroad. He stayed in Geneva with Calvin, who praised his erudition, integrity, and other virtues. In Rotterdam, he drew close to Erasmus, helping him out of financial difficulties by buying his library and leaving it with him for life. He was then invited to England by Thomas Cranmer and given a pension by Edward VI, who appointed him chaplain to the foreign Protestants who had taken refuge in England. Known in England as John à Lasco, he collaborated with Cranmer on the Book of Common Prayer in 1552, but with the accession of Queen Mary, he was forced to leave the country. He reached Poland in time for the First Calvinist Synod in 1554, at which he urged greater unity and a closing of ranks by all dissenters against the Catholic hierarchy. But his pleas were drowned out by disputes over minor theological and administrative questions. Waski died in 1560, and it was not until 1570 that any kind of agreement was reached in the Consensus of St. Moritz, but this failed to produce the sort of Protestant front he had hoped for. End quote. Following the death of Waski, the attentions of the would-be Polish reformers found themselves pushing the Reformation not so much in a religious direction as in a political direction. In fact, the emphasis became not the reform or abolition of any religious practices, but instead the emphasis was on the Church's role in temporal politics. In that sense, while Waski and other more theologically minded reformers would have been disappointed in the spiritual outcome, more politically focused reformers were delighted. In Poland, these politically focused reformers were known as the Executionists. That may sound at first read like they're in favor of executions. That would be a pretty interesting twist to the story, but alas, it's more technical than that. While they were in favor of executions, it wasn't the execution of people so much as the proper execution of the law that they were interested in. Is that more boring? Yes, but at least they got a cool name, I guess. As Zamoyski tells us, quote, a purely political reformist movement had come into existence at the beginning of the century. In spirit, it was very close to the Reformation, since it placed the accent not on innovation, but on stricter observance of the law, on weeding out malpractice and corruption. It was known as the Movement for the Execution of the Laws, or simply the Executionist movement. One of its first preoccupations was that the law itself should be codified and published in clear form, and as a result, much groundwork was done in the first half of the century, culminating in a number of legal reforms passed in 1578, which fixed the legal system for the next 200 years. End quote. In terms of specific reformist victories, the executionists made some clear progress. They got the church to contribute to the finances of the state, and removing the church from parts of the judicial system. However, these victories weren't unopposed, and in time the Counter-Reformation gained the upper hand. The Polish church leaders, those in line with Rome, were more patient with those that argued on theological grounds, leaning more towards discussion than violent reprisal. Which isn't to say that violent reprisals and executions didn't happen. There just weren't nearly as many of them as there were in, say, England. Over time, that helped the Polish leaders bring people back into the more orthodox fold, especially when some Protestant sects began to become ultra-aggressive in other parts of Europe, giving the Polish leaders the opportunity to take the moral high ground, point to them, and say, hey, at least we're not as bad as those guys. There was one interesting outcome from this period of aborted Reformation: religious liberty. In 1573, the Sejm passed a law that stated, quote, whereas in our Commonwealth there is no small disagreement in the matter of the Christian faith, and in order to prevent that any harmful contention should arise from this, as we see clearly taking place in other kingdoms, we swear to each other, in our name and in that of our descendants forevermore, on our honor, our faith, our love, and our consciences, that albeit we are dissenters in religion, we will keep the peace between ourselves, and that we will not, for the sake of our various faith and differences of church, either shed blood or confiscate property, deny favor, imprison or banish, and that furthermore we will not aid or abet any power or office which strives to this in any way whatsoever. End quote. And so, with that act of the Sejm, freedom of religion was enshrined. Not universally and forevermore in some perfect world, but far more than in most places in the world at that time. Which brings us, strangely enough, to the Union of Lublin. You may be asking, Trevor, how does an act of religious liberty bring us to a treaty that enshrined a noble democracy uniting Poland and Lithuania? That's an excellent question, anonymous listener. Let's take a look at the trends and major events we've identified so far in this episode. First, there is a clear tidal wave of support for well-written laws that are properly enforced. Second, there is a strong belief amongst the nobility, but also among the people at large, in the idea of personal liberty. And third, there is no heir due to the chaos of Sigismund's personal life. Now, while those all influence the religious life of Poles, they influence the political situation all the more so. After all, if Sigismund dies with no heir, it would mean the possible separation of Poland and Lithuania, which could lead to a curtailing of personal liberty, and also a breakdown in the proper execution of laws and statutes. So, in order to minimize the risk of that catastrophic failure, action was needed. Action like the Union of Lublin. For those that aren't familiar with this law, the Union of Lublin was a treaty signed on July 1st, 1569, that created a new state out of the old states of Poland and Lithuania. The act is lengthy, as of course it is for one of such importance, but the key points were the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania would be combined into one state, that this state would be ruled over by one common king, that the king would be elected by joint votes of Poles and Lithuanians, that the same would be combined into one that included both Poles and Lithuanians, and that the king would in many ways be bound by the laws passed by the same. In all, the reform resembled reforms that took place in many other countries a few hundred years later, and because of that, it is quite a leap forward. However, it did lack many modern-day political safeguards, which eventually led to stability problems. More on those in a much later episode. In all, though, what the Union meant in the short term was that when Sigismund Augustus passed away without an heir, the realm would remain intact. And that's exactly what happened when he died almost exactly 3 years later on July 7th, 1572, at the age of 51. Of course, just because there would be stability does not mean that things all of a sudden become boring. No, because on the death of Sigismund Augustus, the Jagiellonian dynasty had no heir apparent, and so it fell to the same to elect a new king. And who would they pick? But of course, the second son of the King of France, Henry de Valois. And that's where we'll pick up next time. As always, thanks for listening, and thank you to all of you who support the show on Patreon. With our entrance into a new era of Polish history, your support has meant the ability to buy new books and resources to research these episodes. If you'd like to join these supporters, you can do so at patreon.com/History of Poland podcast. You can also follow the show on most of the social networks at History of Poland Podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening.